Thank you for joining me for these live internet studies week after week. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi, and the live internet studies are two studies that are broken up to one being an hour long, the other being a half an hour long, 30 minutes. The first study is entitled Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events, where we study prophecy and specifically end time prophecy, book of Daniel type of stuff, Jesus, all of it, discourses, rapture discussions, book of Revelation, mark of the beast, Antichrist. So we're going in that direction eventually. As you can see on my screen, there's this topical list that shows us where we're kind of going in that direction. The yellow part where you see where it says topic 11, making a case for the pre-wrath view, that's where we're at right now. The 30-minute segment, the second segment of this hour and a half long study, is entitled A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism. It is an apologetic study, and we normally are comparing and contrasting biblical Unitarian, which is a non-Trinitarian denomination of Christianity. We normally are comparing and contrasting Bible verses that they are putting on the table that they believe are non-Trinitarian leaning, and we are trying to reclaim those for the side of Trinity. I myself am a biblical Trinitarian. I believe in the incarnation. I believe that God is 3 in 1, 1 in 3, the whole the language you're probably familiar with. So if that's the topic you like, then stick around for both segments. Okay, let's jump into segment 1. Topic 11, making a case for the pre-wrath view. And what I'm working from is a set of timelines and models of the rapture. We're really still talking about the rapture. This is topic 11, making a case for the pre-wrath view. And so when we ask the question, when will God rapture the church, there are 4 sort of answers that have been proposed. We've got in the upper left corner of the screen right now, we've got the pre-trib rapture, which says that the church will be raptured before this final 7-year period known as Daniel's 7th week. I'll tell you what Daniel's 7th week is in a moment, but first let me just tell you the 4 main views. Next, we have the mid-trib rapture that I don't spend a lot of time on. Frankly, I don't think there's a lot of meaningful information that can be gleaned by studying the mid-tribulation rapture that carefully. But nevertheless, it's one of the views. Mid-trib rapturists believe the rapture will occur exactly halfway through the 7-year period just before the beginning of the Great Tribulation. Again, we're still talking about this 7-year tribulation, or 7 years of time that are allotted for some specific events to take place. The third view that's on discussion is the lower left corner, post-tribulation rapture. They believe that the rapture will occur following the 7-year period known as Daniel's 70th week. So in the classic sense, you can see that the pre-trib one and the post-trib one are just diametrically opposed, right? One puts the rapture way at the beginning and one puts the rapture way at the very end. But most of the details in the middle are identical. I mean, they all look the same to me. Nevertheless, the fourth view on the discussion here on the board is the model known as pre-wrath rapture, lower right corner. What do they believe? Pre-wrath rapturists believe the rapture will occur following the opening of the 6th seal of the book of Revelation. The church will experience severe persecution by the Antichrist, but will be snatched away before God begins to pour out his wrath during the day of the Lord. So those are the 4 views. When I talk about the book of Daniel and the 70 weeks altogether that all of these models are kind of working from, so you've got, and I won't spend too much time on this either, basically you've got 490 years that were given to Daniel that were basically for his people. And the important thing to remember is that this was a slice of history that would be played out, as far as I can tell, given what events need to take place in this prophecy, would be played out over a long period of time, whether you think all of the 490 years were all together or whether they were split apart by this gap in the middle known as the time of the Gentiles. Either way, we still have a lot of time needed for many of these events to take place. They don't seem to be taking place in 490 weeks or 490 days or 490 months or something. Weeks of years, remember they're called weeks in the Bible. Shavua is a Hebrew word, but I believe the best understanding is that they're literal 7-year, prophetic 7-year, meaning 360 days, 7 sevens. So we had 483 that took place earlier. Some events took place. This is past history. We then had the first century where Messiah came and cut off, and this initiated a what many recognize is a gap with the times of the Gentiles occupying most of this time frame of the gap. However, according to this same model, in the future, there's this final 70th week, so a one final 7-year time frame, in which some very significant things will take place. And so that's kind of what we're working from, is the understanding that in the futurist model, which I hold to, there is a future coming 7 years in which all these events will take place. So where's the study going tonight? Actually, we're going to be continuing looking at Ron Wallace's notes here. Ron Wallace is a pre-tribber, such as myself. Again, let me read his little description about him. Ron Wallace teaches through the Bible Fragrances Biblical Studies Institute, organized for the purpose of interpreting and communicating the Word of God through this website and through live Bible studies. Ron has written many articles on Bible prophecy from a premillennial and pre-wrath perspective. His various studies and commentaries can be found on the Bible Fragrances website at BibleFragrances.com. What we're doing for this study, this is entitled, There Is Only One Second Coming. That's the name of the video that you're watching right now. And so what I'm working from, let me go back over to the slides for a second. What I'm working from is, if you look at the pre-trib rapture model that's in front of you right now, essentially, they believe, based on dispensationalism, that there's a secret rapture that exists outside of the time frame known as the 70th week of Daniel, or the 7-year tribulation. This secret rapture, this imminent rapture, this anytime rapture, separates, it's really the end of the time period for the church, and yet it is needed because a rapture of the church is promised to keep God's people from the wrath of God, verses such as 1 Thessalonians 5:9 uses. Well, in their model of a rapture, when they read about the second coming of Christ, which is way over here on the far right, in their model, the rapture and the second coming are two different events. The rapture is called the rapture. The second coming is called the second coming, or the glorious appearing. Sometimes that's what the second coming is called in their model. But in so doing, by separating these two events by the 7 years in between, it causes what a lot of Bible teachers recognize is effectively or functionally 2 second comings. Because basically, the rapture is a type of coming for Christians or for the church, and the second coming is a type of coming for Israel, something to that effect. That's their model. And so in examining rapture timing and rapture models, we begin to look at passages in the New Testament, and we begin to closely examine them and ask ourselves, are there really two comings? Is there really a secret rapture? Pre-tribbers say yes, and this is still the majority position in Christian circles, especially among evangelicals. I don't know that it's the majority position among, say, other non-evangelical groups, such as, Catholic groups. I don't know if they're large. I need to look at the surveys, the data. But from an evangelical perspective, pre-tribulationism still rules the roost. So they believe that there is they won't say there's a first and second coming, or a second and third coming. They don't use that language. They just say that there's a rapture and a second coming. So that way they can kind of have their cake and eat it too, because what we're going to find out tonight as we look through Ron's notes, there are a number of passages that describe one second coming, a single second coming. And so if you ask a pre-tribber which single second coming is in view when you're reading these passages, this is where they have to kind of as the late Dr. Heiser would put it, they have to cheat a little bit. They fudge. In other words, there are passages that describe the second coming of Yeshua, but the language is either conspicuously rapture language, or it could be conspicuously second coming language, one or the other. And so if you ask a pre-tribber, how many second comings are there? They'll probably tell you there's only one second coming, but then they'll say, but there's a rapture 7 years earlier. And so this is how I think they can have their cake and eat it too. They can still say that there's only one second coming, yet they recognize that there's this secret rapture that takes place 7 years earlier. Again, the mid-tribulation model says there's a rapture here, there's a second coming here. They're separated by 3.5 years, but the events are still split. The late Dr. Heiser would describe these models like pre-trib and mid-trib as splitters. He said that they would take the events in these passages that they find that describe that when Jesus returns, where some of the language describes a rapture and other passages, like we're going to read tonight, describe a second coming. And because they look like they're two different events, then in your mind you split them. And so Dr. Heiser calls you people splitters. Well, when we go over to the post-trib rapture, we find that their rapture and their second coming are synonymous events. And so they are not splitters. What did Dr. Heiser call them? He called you guys joiners. So you got the splitters and the joiners. So the post-trib raptures look at all these verses about the second coming of Messiah, and they are led to the conclusion that since it seems to indicate a single second coming, since all the passages seem to indicate that there's only one, the language of the Bible lends itself towards the most natural understanding that there's only one second coming. And therefore, post-trib takes their cue from that to believe that there is only one rapture / second coming. They kind of downplay the rapture. They downplay it so much that there's no need to go up to heaven for any length of time at all. We do go up, but we meet the Lord in the air, and then we just accompany him right back down to earth, and then we begin to usher in the millennial kingdom. And so in their model, there's still only one second coming, but they are joining everything. The day of the Lord activities that we read about in the book of Revelation in this model must take place in the 7-year time frame, kind of prior to the rapture, which is tacked on to the very end, at least in this classic version of post-trib rapturism. So from their perspective, we Christians go through all the wrath, but like God protected Israel of old in the book of Exodus from the plagues, God can protect and will protect in their model the Christians who are still on earth from his own wrath. Either we will be hidden away like Goshen style, Goshen principle, in our own little location somehow, wherever we are on planet Earth, or we'll be supernaturally shielded. I mean, God is a supernatural being. He can do that. I've even heard one preacher who holds to the post-trib model say that maybe God will actually change our bodies, kind of like what happens at the resurrection. Maybe that'll take place first, and then in our supernatural bodies we'll be shielded from God's wrath. Something to that effect. So those are some proposals for how to make sense of the single second coming language, and yet there's rapture language as well. Well, what are the pre-wrath models? What do we do about that? I'm a pre-wrather myself. I would say that there is a rapture, but then we have a second coming. But let me redraw that. Sorry, I lost my little pointer. Okay, there is a rapture, but then the second coming includes all of these events. Really, all of it is the second coming, so there's only one of them. But in the pre-wrath model, the rapture is the initiating event, and the battle of Armageddon at the very end, where Yeshua comes down and does battle with Antichrist, that event is the concluding event. So for the pre-wrath model, according to Dr. Heiser, because there are two events, there's one here and one here. According to Dr. Heiser, we pre-wrathers would be qualified as splitters. Remember, joiners and splitters. So yeah, we're splitters in that regard. However, what we emphasize as pre-wrathers, and then I'm going to jump into I don't know if he's a doctor or not, but Ron Wallace's notes. What we pre-wrathers emphasize is that in our model, it's not necessary to describe the second coming of Christ as two events. nor is it necessary to collapse the rapture on top of the Battle of Armageddon. So what we try to do is we look at some of the strengths of the pre-trib model, where we recognize that there are two differing events being described by certain passages, and then we look at the strength of the post-trib model, where we realize that the Bible is describing one return of Christ at the end of the age, and we harmonize those two views by calling this model pre-wrath, saying we Christians will be rescued from the wrath of Satan, which is the great tribulation, all of that, will be rescued by the rapture, and then the second coming, which is initiated by the rapture, will bring down God's wrath, which is the day of the Lord, on top of planet Earth, on top of wicked humans, on top of the Antichrist and his eighth beast empire, his one world beast system. God's wrath will punish those. They are the ones that Paul calls in 2 Thessalonians sons of the darkness, right? The children of darkness, of which he contrasts by telling us Christians that we are not of the darkness, we are of the day. So I believe that it's in that context where Paul tells us that God has not appointed us to wrath. The wrath belongs to the darkness. The wrath is reserved for unrepentant sinners. The wrath is leveled against the enemies of God, namely the Antichrist and the evil forces that will be ruining planet Earth at that time. So God's wrath, the second coming of Christ, the day of the Lord, all of that is intended for evil to be expunged from earth, which will culminate in the Battle of Armageddon, where Jesus finally destroys the ultimate enemy, not death, but the ultimate personification of enemy at that time, which will be the Antichrist. So in the pre-wrath model, we still keep the one single second coming of Christ. There's only one coming. There's only one second coming. It is the single second coming that entails an initiating event known as the pre-wrath rapture and a culminating event known as the Battle of Armageddon. But the two events taken as a whole, when looking at the Bible passages, are correctly described as the single second coming. So that's the model that I work from. There's one last detail that I wanted to bring out, and then I'll jump into Ron Wallace's notes. There's a new version of post-trib that's called post-trib pre-wrath that's making the rounds in evangelical circles, that's picking up a lot of popularity, picking up a lot of traction. And this version of post-trib pre-wrath, it still has a lot of the activities. Sorry, let me redraw that. It still has a lot of the activities, such as the rapture and the Battle of Armageddon, maybe taking place at the end of the week instead of like closer, like we did earlier with the pre-wrath model. It still pushes a lot of the events towards the very end, but what it noticeably does, and I think it gets right, is that it switches the position between the rapture and the day of the Lord. If you notice, this version up here is the classic post-trib. And in the classic post-trib, in the broadest sense of the word, the day of the Lord runs its course through the 7-year tribulation, which would include the wrath of Satan, the wrath of evil men, the wrath of God. They're kind of all mixed and together in differing degrees, right? They kind of start off small and then get bigger and bigger and bigger and more pronounced as we go along. But the post-tribbers still believe that all of this is the tribulation period, or the day of the Lord, the day. And then when we get to the very end, we get our rapture, resurrection, Battle of Armageddon, and then the ushering in of the kingdom. All of that takes place towards the very end in the classic post-trib, that one. But when we begin to compare this with the post-trib pre-wrath, notice what happens with the rapture. It switches places with the day of the Lord, right? The day of the Lord is, and in these models, is opposite, which causes Christians in the post-trib pre-wrath model to escape the day of the Lord, yet still have to go through the tribulation, which would have been this part here. All of this is tribulation, and yet the rapture separates us from that. Versus in this model above, Christians go through all of the tribulation and through God's wrath, and we're supernaturally protected either via Goshen principle style or some other principle. So I think it's worth sitting up and recognizing and giving credit to the post-trib pre-wrath model, because it begins to line up more accurately, in my opinion, with what we pre-wrathers are already trying to say, is that we don't need to go through wrath, right? In other words, this is the separator. This separation right here between day of the Lord and rapture, right? There are two compartments. Rapture is what excuses us from the wrath of God. We don't have to be protected supernaturally like ghost and principle style. Instead, we just have to bear the brunt of Antichrist. And I think that's the best way to understand the passages. But again, they could be wrong. I could be wrong. All right. Having said that, let's jump over to Ron Wallace's notes. So on this website that you're looking at Bible Prophecy Daily, it's actually a podcast website. Ron Wallace did a bunch of teachings. You can see them here in front of you. I'm scrolling past them very quickly. If I go down to the very bottom of the screen, his very first podcast that he did way back in February of 2023 was entitled, There's Only One Second Coming. That's kind of, I think that's the same title as my YouTube video that you're watching right now. So let's jump into that study. That's where we left off. And that's going to occupy the remainder of our study for the most part. All right. Before we get started, I backed up a paragraph so we can get a running start at where we left off last week. So Ron is going to begin to build his case as a pre-wrather that there's only one second coming of Christ from verses in the Bible that use language such as parousia in the Greek, language such as erchomai in the Greek, language that indicates that there's a single noun when we talk about parousia, a presence of God, a presence of Jesus, a presence of Yeshua over planet Earth, on planet Earth. And it's important as we look at the passages that we're going to do here tonight that we don't lose sight of the fact that in this model that Ron is proposing, which I also hold to, which largely post-tribbers do as well, that there's only one second coming. It's the pre-tribbers that have a problem with wrapping their mind around a single second coming that includes a secret 7-year rapture sometime earlier. That's where their theology gets, in my opinion, goes a bit off course. It tends to be less accurate. Although in the end, if you think about it, all four groups that you saw on that slide earlier where there's the four, all four groups would probably agree that there's only one second coming. But again, the prominent splitters would say that there's a rapture event and then a second coming event, versus the post-tribbers are going to say, no, there's only a single event. Not only is there one event known as the second coming, but there's not even two different activities associated. When I say activities, look at this slide here that I created. Just be real quick. This is the part of the 7-year where we've already had the so just imagine that we've got the 7 years. And then we've got the midpoint, and then we've got the rapture that separates the final second half. So if you take this part here that I'm kind of coloring in, and imagine that that's this part right here, then you can kind of understand what this slice represents. Okay, so when we zoom in just in that the final day of the Lord, part of the 70th week of Daniel. So this is not the entire 7 years. This is not the beginning of the 7 years like the pre-trib say, and this is not the end of the 7 years. So don't get confused with what you're looking at. This is not a 7-year time span right here, okay? This is rather, it might even be just one really calendar year long, right? Where Isaiah talks about how the year of the Lord, the day of the Lord, the year of the Lord, he kind of transposes those two labels. Anyway, what I propose is that with the rapture being the initiating event and the Battle of Armageddon being the concluding event, well, what I want to challenge the post-tribbers, this is probably one of the primary reasons why I'm having this video and why I'm also not just a post-tribber. What I challenge the post-tribbers with, people like Joel Richardson, and those who are very, very popular post-tribbers, people like Dr. Michael Brown, people like Professor Craig Keener. I'll flash their pictures in post-production so you can see what I'm talking about. People like Pastor John Piper, and then so 5 guys. The 5 guys that I like to mention: Brown, Keener, Richardson, Piper, and Moo. I keep forgetting Dr. Douglas Moo. He's in your list. You can see his picture on there. So you got 5 really prominent post-tribbers. And they all seem to teach some kind of to some differing degrees. I don't know if they fully agree in their articulation. They all teach some different degree of where the rapture and the Battle of Armageddon, or the second coming they call it, are basically the same event. They're kind of collapsed on top of one another, or they're only maybe a day apart, or they're half day apart. Either way, the mistake that I think all of those post-tribbers make, and I say this respectfully, guys, to all five of you. If I actually were sitting in front of all five of you right now, I'm speaking as if you guys are like sitting in front of me. And so this goes out to anyone out there who's a post-tribber as well. I say this in all respect. The difference that I'm proposing as a pre-wrather is really, in one sense, kind of minimal, right? It's a very minor detail that I'm bringing up, where the rapture and the Battle of Armageddon are separated by the Day of the Lord activities in the middle. On the one hand, it's minimal because I don't truly know exactly how long the Day of the Lord activities are going to play themselves out, although there are some indicators that are given in the book of Revelation that it should take a length of time to play itself out. And if we just read Revelation, the events in the book of Revelation, starting with chapter 6 or so with the book of Revelation, working our way through, say, chapter 19, that large slice there describes 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. And I take the view that they are sequential, that they're not just recapitulating the exact same events, same 7 events over and over again, where the seals are the trumpets and the trumpets are the bowls and the bowls are the seals. I don't take that view. I take the view that the seals and the trumpets and the bowls are separate events. But the reason I'm having this discussion is I would tell you 5 gentlemen, as well as anyone else out there who's a post-tribber, let's not sharply and strongly divide on this issue of whether the rapture and the Battle of Armageddon are the same event or whether they're split events, like Dr. Heiser would say, and how long is the Day of the Lord. I think we can all agree that we need to be prepared for the second coming of the Lord, and that we need to be prepared to go through something, even if you are a post-trib pre-wrather and you don't believe you're going to go through the wrath of God like I do, or whether you're a classic post-tribber where you believe you're going to be here on planet Earth during the wrath of God being poured out. Either way, we need to be prepared. It's the message that we are sharing, we pre-wrathers and we post-tribbers, that we're trying to tell those who are not in our camps, namely you pre-tribbers out there. What we're trying to tell you guys is, you guys really need to be careful, because if your model is wrong, this has the potential to shipwreck your Christian walk. I'm not saying it'll remove you from your relationship with Jesus. I believe you're once genuinely saved, eternally genuinely saved. Once truly saved, always truly saved. Not just once saved, always saved, but once truly saved, always truly saved. I believe you can't lose your salvation. And if you, whether your rapture theology is wonky, that doesn't have any effect or bearing on your salvation and your relationship with God. But to the degree that you might be unprepared to face the Antichrist, it could cause a lot of unnecessary suffering and stress and agitation and questioning your own beliefs and faith, and maybe even anger and bitterness towards the denomination that taught you a pre-trib rapture. They told you you weren't going to see the Antichrist. They told you were going to be rescued from all that. Suddenly you find yourself facing the Antichrist because it turns out that the post-tribbers and pre-wrathers are right. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that we need to encourage one another during these times, right? We don't need to attack one another. Really, no matter which model you hold to, if you're a genuine Christian, we need to encourage one another. We need to stand together, because guess what? Antichrist doesn't care what model you hold to. If you're a Christian or if you're a Jew during that time, when this time comes, if we do go into this time period as Christians and Jews, he will be looking for us. He doesn't care what model we hold to. He just cares that we're going to be resisting him. That we are not naming him as God, that we're not declaring him as God, that we're not taking his mark system. That's what he cares about. So he's going to come after us. So there's a heavy amount of my plea, kind of a pastoral plea, kind of like what Joel Richardson does, which I really appreciate. You know, me and Joel Richardson, despite my differences and disagreements with him, we actually walk hand in hand on a lot of issues, especially our pro-Israel stance. We also both have a pastoral heart where we're trying to reach out to other Christians and saying, look, guys, we need to stand together more than we need to divide. So that is the message that I'm trying to convey in these teachings. Be more unified than you are divided. We can have our discussions in the in-house room about No, it's a split event. No, it's a joint event. No, it's a rapture versus and a separate Armageddon. No, they're all one event. Okay, but in the end, we would do better to have a mindset is more unified, rallying around the banner of our Messiah Yeshua, standing firm with him and on his promises, because we're going to need it in that day when the Antichrist comes after us and comes after our families. And whether we make it through that time period, like Paul says, we who are alive and remain, or whether we lose our life, we absolutely must not denounce the name of Yeshua. Amen? Amen. So that's all I'm going to say on that matter. Let's jump over to Ron Wallace. I think what I said there earlier was very important. That's why I stopped and made a point of saying all that. But now I can kind of whiz through Ron's material. So Ron is pushing for 1 second coming. He's a pre-wrather such as myself. He still splits Rapture from Armageddon like I do. So unlike the post-tribbers, he splits Rapture from Armageddon just like I do. But so he allows for about a year to separate those two events. Not 7 years, not 3.5 years like the mid-tribbers, but at least maybe a year, or at the very least 5 months, because that's what the book of Revelation, chapter 9, verse 5, talks about the fifth trumpet being 5 months long. So at least 5 months, but probably more likely longer than 5 months. Like I said, if Isaiah is correct, maybe a year. What does Ron say about the second coming and why is it relevant for us? Let's jump in where we left off last week. Here's Ron Wallace. He says, the second coming of Jesus is a presence which involves an extended period of time during which several events will occur. All of the second coming passages look at 1 second coming, which will begin with his initial arrival in the clouds of the sky. Then, and so very carefully watch what he's saying, then additional information is added to show some event. Notice he's got that in quotation marks, some event that will occur in connection with that arrival. So that's why we say, going back to this one, that's why we pre-wrathers say that there's the initiating event known as the rapture, which kicks off the second coming of Christ, which will then include all of the trumpets and bowl judgments, but not the seals. That's all the activities following Revelation chapter 6, are all the stuff in the middle. So we call that Yeshua's parousia, 1 single second coming. And then after all of these events in the middle run their course, we've got this Battle of Armageddon, which takes place as a culminating event. But the point is that all of this stuff in the middle are the activities that we read about in different passages in different locations. If you're reading the Old Testament, a lot of this stuff is going to wear the label Day of the Lord. That's the label given to all that, this really, really bad stuff in the middle, the destruction of Israel's armies, the destruction of a lot of parts of Jerusalem itself, the massing of armies around Jerusalem, sometimes in destruction of Jerusalem, other times in favor of God fighting for Jerusalem. Depending on which passage you read, you'll sometimes encounter either Israel is losing or Israel's winning, depending on what part of the day of the Lord is in view. We also see that there will be a lot of judgment language that's associated with the day of the Lord, because the purpose of the day of the Lord, as I mentioned, is not just to punish unrepentant sinners, human beings who have rejected God, rejected his Messiah, rejected the truth that could have saved them, but also a major primary purpose of Yeshua's parousia, the second coming, the day of the Lord, that we're going to be reading about in some of these passages, and we're going to see this that carries over into the New Testament as well. A primary purpose is for God to defeat his enemies, the enemies of Messiah, the enemies of his Son, the enemies of the truth. This would include the Antichrist and his false prophet. This would include the principalities and the powers, the cosmic forces that oppose God, the sons of God that rebelled against God back in the Old Testament, the divine council members that committed crimes against God as their king, as their maker, as their created. These other Elohim. You can tell I've been studying a lot of Dr. Heiser lately, right? When I use the phrase divine council. God needs to punish them as well, because they're going to be ruining planet Earth. They're going to be deceiving humans. They have been They have been disrupting activities on planet Earth for as long as there has been a planet, right? They've just been wreaking havoc, wreaking havoc on planet Earth. So all those enemies have to be dealt with as well before the kingdom can be ushered in. The final enemy of God, of course, will be death, but he gets to live throughout the 1,000 years, right? He doesn't get defeated until the 1,000 years are up. But the Antichrist gets thrown into the lake of fire at the end of the 70th week. So hallelujah, praise God for that. So what Ron is going to be explaining for us is that when we read these second coming passages, the anchor to understanding how these passages work is to start with the idea that there's one second coming. Start there, and then from there, build your theology on which details are describing rapture and which details are describing Armageddon-like events and what details are in between. All the while realizing it's still one giant event known as the second coming of Christ onto planet Earth. And again, you're not going to get a complete picture of the day of the Lord if you start in the New Testament. Even if you just start in the book of Revelation, you're still not going to get the complete understanding of, again, we're talking about the time period known as the parousia of Yeshua, also known as the day of Christ, also known as the day of the Lord, also known as God's wrath. You're not going to get a complete picture unless you start in the Old Testament. So start there where the types and shadows of the day of the Lord are pictured by God judging certain of Israel's enemies, like Babylon, or God judging Israel herself. Remember, the day of the Lord is also a time period I almost forgot. It's not just to judge evil. It's also a time period where Israel has to be brought to her knees so that she can embrace her Messiah. Let me go back over to this slide just for a split second.